Welcome to Lecture 4, Mergers and Acquisitions Performance. I'm sure you're aware that most acquisitions are supposed to fail based upon a large amount of data, with experts estimating somewhere between 50% and even as high as 80% of M&A fail. And this raises two very interesting questions. The first one is, if this is true, why do so many fail? And secondly, if it's true, why do so many managers continue to spend so much money on deals? Clearly, all of this rests upon how we think about performance, and that's going to be the subject of this lecture. Whilst you've all heard about the overall failure rates for M&A, it's a very complex topic, and one of the issues is which perspective you're evaluating an M&A from. So you may remember in the previous lecture, the strategy lecture, that I was talking about different perspectives on the famous painting by Velázquez. Well, the same applies here, which is to say, whilst we're all looking at M&A, who is doing the looking, who's doing the viewing, and how do they view performance? So if we look at macroeconomists, for instance, their main question is, does M&A benefit society? In other words, rather than necessarily looking at single deals, they're looking at all of the deals together and saying, is there benefit created for society by all these M&A taking place? And there's no doubt some countries are very pro M&A, such as the UK or the USA, and there are other countries which are far more defensive and are not convinced that they're necessarily good for society. And that's reflected, of course, in their regulations and controls. A second type of perspective might be from a strategist, perhaps a strategy director, inside a company, who will simply be asking, does M&A establish or sustain firm-level strategic advantage? So often, obviously, viewing from the perspective of one company, they'll be saying, by making this acquisition, will this strengthen my business and allow it to compete more effectively in the future? Another colleague of his, say the finance director, will be thinking slightly differently. He'll be saying, does M&A add to shareholder value? In other words, will our share prices and the value that's created be immediately apparent from that perspective? Then from other top managers' point of view, say the CEO for instance, there may be a more managerial benefit. So do the top management team or indeed the CEO benefit in some way? And then from an employee's point of view, or even the unions, they may be more concerned about whether their jobs are protected. So performance assessment depends very much upon whose perspective is being adopted. Another feature of multiple perspectives is that the performance doesn't always coincide depending on your perspective. So for instance, if you're the finance director interested in high shareholder returns, this might have immediate consequences for the loss of top managerial jobs. So managers are likely to be highly resistant. If it's about achieving greater size, which is for good often for top managers, shareholders may suffer because this may in fact not be value creating. If the deals are about efficiency gains, which might boost the bottom line, a consequence may be a loss of jobs, and therefore you'll get union resistance. Another example we had earlier was if you increase bargaining power of the acquirer along the value chain, this might reduce customer and supplier choice and value. And this might lead to public outcry. So for instance, when Morrison's was trying to acquire Safeways, pig breeders and other suppliers were very vocal, saying that this deal would damage the supply chain and local producers. Therefore, not only do we have different perspectives by different stakeholders, even if we take a single perspective, let's talk about the finance perspective on shareholder value, you still get complexity. So for instance, whether M&A destroys shareholder value, the first thing to ask is, well, which shareholders are we talking about? And over what period of time? And indeed, how are you actually going to measure it? So for instance, some shareholders might be institutions or pension funds that might have quite long-term horizons where they're more interested in stability of earnings over time and dividends than short-term financial return. But if you're an arbitrager as a shareholder, you're definitely looking for a short-term return. And so these financial calculations are not the same, and the periods of assessment or period of time over which we assess gain is also not the same. Now, there's a huge finance literature which shows differences in assessment due to different assumptions and methods that are used. And I can give you some overall findings, which are that on average, acquired shareholders benefit significantly. On the UK stock market, for instance, an average would be around an uplift of, say, 26-27%. So that's an average figure for acquired shareholders. And the reason for that is the acquirer is having to transfer value to acquired shareholders in order to encourage them to sell their shares. Acquiring shareholders, on the other hand, tend to have slightly negative gains. At best they break even, but they probably make a small loss. And this is what we call a wealth transfer effect, where wealth is being transferred from the acquiring shareholders to the acquired shareholders in order to pay that acquisition premium. If we combine the returns to see if their overall effect is good, we find that this is true. Combined returns are slightly positive. So for those macroeconomists worried about social impact and social benefit, M&A would seem to be a good thing for the economy as a whole. And it's that sort of logic which underpins the attraction of M&A to the UK, to the US and other Anglo-American type economies. Now, there are many management consultancies that provide performance studies on M&A, and these go back a long time. So, for instance, in this table, you can see a consultancy called Business International was running performance studies back in 1973 using 400 postal questionnaires, and they estimated that 49% of M&A fail. Now, these performance studies come out on a fairly regular basis, and there's a range here that you might want to look through, including companies like A.T. Kearney, KPMG, McKinsey's and Mercer. And if you look at the failure rates on the right-hand side, you'll see they range from 48% failing right through to a stunning 83% estimated by KPMG's report in 1999. So there's a big range in performance. The second thing to note here is the method. These companies are using very different methods to assess success. Some are using postal questionnaires, some are using interviews, and some are using data that's available online. Also, they're looking at different types of measure of success. So, for instance, Coopers and Lybrand's study in 1992 was based on senior executive perceptions, looking at the UK's top 100 companies, and they estimated a 54% failure rate. Their latest study, as a consequence of being criticised, by the way, for the early study, was to use hard data such as revenue, cash flow and profitability, which gave an even higher level of failure. KPMG 1999 tried to look at price trends, equity price trends, versus the trends of their industries, both pre and post deal, and they came out with a very high figure of 83% failure. So the first point to take away here is that there are multiple ways in which you might assess acquisition performance, and consultants here have been using various different measures. I think we always have to be a little careful of consultants' reports because they're often not transparent about their methods, their sampling techniques and so forth, and that may mean that some of the indications are somewhat distorted. And I think I can illustrate that particularly with the KPMG study, which in fact I gave a speech on some time ago, in that they use an extremely aggressive way of determining success and failure, which is why they end up with such a high failure rate. And of course, you have to ask who would benefit from such high failure rates, and maybe it's for consultants to come in and actually solve the problem. So there could be a certain amount of distortion there. Whilst I do have quite a high regard for studies coming from, say, McKinsey's, and they do tend to be fairly transparent in their methodologies, I tend to trust the academic research more because by definition they do have to be very, very transparent in their methods, and all their research is peer reviewed if it goes into very high quality journals. So therefore I think we can be more certain that their results have greater validity. Now, as I've hinted at before, there are different perspectives on performance, and here we're looking at pre-merger returns. And so one group of academics, which we'll call financial economists, tend to carry out performance studies based upon share price. The idea here is that the share price is a full and fair assessment of future firm value. So obviously it includes today's value, plus some prediction about what the future value would be, normally estimated through dividends over time. And what they're looking for is abnormal share returns to shareholders during an event window. So abnormal share returns are where a particular acquirer's shares change in price, which can't be explained by changes in price for other companies in the same industry. So it's abnormal in those terms. And also they're looking during an event window, which is a period of time that surrounds the actual acquisition announcement date. So they're looking for abnormal returns in a very short period of time. And this intellectually makes sense, or logically makes sense, because if you believe that shares are a full and fair assessment of all future value, then any shift in share value over an event window that's abnormal must be due to the value of the actual acquisition. Now, I have a range of studies here from Bradley in 1988, who looked at the time period 1963 to 1984, right through to Andrade, Mitchell and Stafford in 2001, looking again over a reasonable time period, 5 years. And one thing to note with many of these studies is that they tend to look at a large number of target companies. So in the Andrade, Mitchell and Stafford paper, they look at 3,688. So often looking at large volumes of deals to avoid distorting effects of small numbers of deals. And they also use various event windows. In the Andrade one, they're looking at minus 20 days to when the deal's ultimately closed. Others are looking at greater symmetry, so minus 1 day, plus 1 day. And on the right-hand side, you can see the returns to targets and bidders. So if we look at the Bradley example, there's a 31.77 uplift for target shareholders and a tiny uplift to the bidder of 0.97. If you go to the Andrade article at the bottom, there's an uplift to the target of 23.8%, and here the bidder loses 3.8%. So indicatively, we can say that there is a significant uplift to target shareholders. If we were to average these, it's 23%, and there's a minor decrease in value to bidders. But the combined returns are actually somewhere between 2 and 4%. Event studies have looked at a number of aspects of M&A. One, for instance, is the method of payment. Is it better to use cash or is it better to use stock? Often we find that the bidders tend to do less well if they use stock. As you can see here, it suggests minus 1.6%. And they do slightly better if they use cash, on average minus 0.13%. There's some psychological rationale for this, that rather like when you go shopping, you tend to spend a bit more if you're using a credit card than when you're actually handing over pounds or dollars. Another type of M&A they've looked quite a lot at is whether or not it's good to have single or multiple bidders. And a multiple bidder you would call a contested bid. In other words, several bidders trying to buy the same company. And on average, bidders do worse if there are multiple bidders, because we all compete for the same target, and that tends to drive the price up. Now, there's a different type of academic who we might call industrial economists, who tend to look at longer term assessments rather than just share price movements. And they tend to look at things like accounting data, market share subsequent to the deal, and subsequent divestment. Now, in terms of accounting data, they find that bidders suffer immediate decline in relative profitability, and that's quite a pervasive finding. So there are many studies that show this. Also, they find a subsequent market share decline, and this can often be dramatic. Two fairly important authors here are Muller and Caves, who have done many subsequent papers showing again the same thing. There's an interesting finding because often the main reason for doing deals is to increase market share. So this finding tends to suggest that this is often not as successful as acquirers would like. And then the other type of study looks at whether or not the acquired companies are subsequently sold off or divested. It's a very famous study here by Michael Porter in 1987, looking at 2,000 acquisitions, and he found that 58.5% were subsequently divested, and that, in his view, was a sign of failure. And then there's also a classification of studies where they try to combine multiple measures of performance. And although it's fairly old now, this is John Hunt at London Business School, it's still quite an important study. And looking at multiple measures, he came to the conclusion that around about 50% of all M&A fail. So it seems that if you use lots of different methods for assessment, we're still coming back to the 50% failure figure. Now, strategists tend to look at specific firm characteristics in order to see the link with performance. The first one that's been commented on many times is relative size. The idea here is that if you're too large in relation to the target you're buying, you can end up having underperforming deals. In other words, they use the term avoid sprat catching, which means buying very small fish. How's that defined? Well, 5% turnover of the parent. The reason, again, tends to be organisational, psychological, that if you buy companies that are too small in relation to yourself, it tends to require a great deal of effort to integrate, which you may resent because they're small. And also people may resent the amount of time that you're putting in if you do give them the time they need. So the dice are loaded against you a little bit if you're buying very small targets. Also, there can be problems buying very large targets because there's confusion amongst employees as to which are the most important. You can end up with a type of political arm wrestling, which McKinsey's noted some time ago. So it's not clear who may be dominant if you're both very large companies looking at, say, managers embedded in the organisation. And also there can be a problem with buying too fast, what we would call acquisition rate. You can get some form of corporate indigestion from acquisition fever. You're buying too many companies too fast and you're failing to integrate as you go along. Now today we call them serial acquirers, but I think if you remember back to the Enclean case, you can see one of the problems of buying too fast and not integrating properly. And there are several examples of this. Citigroup is another one where they tried to create a global giant in financial services, and when things started to go wrong, it became clear that they'd not really integrated at all and hoped no one would notice. Another issue is around market share, and this is a very strong, pervasive finding that's often enshrined in acquirers' own deal books. The risk of failure increases substantially as market share decreases. In other words, if you're buying relatively weak performing companies in market share terms in an industry, the chances are that you won't do quite so well. And GE, for instance, has in its M&A playbook buy only the number 1 or number 2 in the industry. Even going down to number 3 will weaken your chances of return. A third one is around financial health. Poor financial health will damage your wealth. So if you buy loss-making targets, they can also do pretty badly unless you have a specific turnaround expertise. Now, some of the early Chinese deals really did badly because the Chinese were cash rich and thought it was just a question of paying off debts, not recognizing that in fact the financial losses were due to poor strategies or poor strategic positioning, and this got in the way of recovery. So it wasn't just about paying the bills. Now, McKinsey's have put together some of these for cross-border deals to advocate that you should buy a strong local presence. 89% of cross-border deals with a strong local presence, by which we mean number 1, number 2 in the market, and good finances succeed, whereas 70% with a medium or poor presence do not repay the cost of capital. So here again we can see that it's good to buy a target that has a strong local presence and is financially healthy. Strategists also recognise that acquiring private firms tends to be better than buying public firms by about 1.5 to 4%. The reasons for this are several. The first, you've generally got a smaller pool of bidders. People may not be aware that these companies are up for sale. They tend to be less complicated to integrate. They can be easier to improve. The systems may not be so sophisticated. The shares, of course, are not listed, so there's not a premium just from the ease of trading. And except for diversification, there's less information asymmetry. So in those terms, acquiring private generally should work out better than just buying public firms, where they have to be far more transparent to investors. In terms of timing, it seems that acquisitions are better to do at the beginning of booms or during a recession when perhaps share values are not inflated. They tend to be less successful during the boom and certainly towards the end of a boom, where there can be some cataclysmic destructions in value when the markets turn. And I'm sure you remember American Online and Time Warner. Also, in terms of pre-acquisition experience, there's a great deal of literature on this, with managers saying it matters, but the academics find it very, very hard to find concrete proof. The only thing we can say is that we can learn from little mistakes in terms of what we shouldn't do, but we still seem to be caught out by some of the really big ones. So experience is not quite as straightforward as we would like to suggest. And the other one that's also rather tricky is relatedness, by which we mean if you buy companies in the same industry in which you currently compete, again, the evidence is conflicting. You would think that if you bought a bank and you're a bank, you would actually understand banking and be able to integrate easily. Often that's not the case, and often you can get some severe cultural conflicts as a result. Equally, you might buy a business in a totally different type of industry or even geography, and yet have no culture conflict because there's very little integration, and that may seem to do quite well. So the relatedness debate is not a simple one, but we will come back to that again. A classic framework in M&A is the FTC Federal Trade Commission classification of different types of deal. It's basically a revision of the Ansoff matrix around market relationships and production relationships. And essentially they use this as a way to try and understand which M&A are likely to have anti-competitive implications. So if a competitor has the same market relationship as the target and also the same production relationship as the target, it would be classified as horizontal. In other words, this is buying a direct competitor, and this is also likely where you're going to get consolidation and greater market power for the acquirer. And this is the danger that the FTC is trying to look out for, where they're getting some sort of monopoly hold on markets. This is not the case so much with the other types. So for instance, you can have market extension, which is going into new market areas but staying with the same production relationship. Equally, you can go into product extension, where you keep the same market relationship but take on new types of product. At the extreme, you can have totally different market relationships and unrelated production relationships, and these are your classic conglomerate M&A. And also within the matrix, we have vertical backward and vertical forward M&A, where companies are actually integrating along the supply chain, probably to reduce things like transaction costs. So these give us some basic guidelines as to different types of M&A from a strategic point of view. Now, the FTC framework is quite interesting in combination with this one, because underlying it there is some assumption around synergy gains. So you'll notice at the top of this chart we have the FTC classifications: horizontal, vertical, market extension, product extension and conglomerate. And on the vertical axis we have the sources of synergy, such as economies of scale, experience effects and so on. And if we look at the horizontal deals, you can see the greatest number of potential areas for synergy gain are in horizontal acquisitions, with economies of scale, which means greater efficiency internally, experience effects from learning, market power, which we've talked about already, and reduction in cost of capital. And as you look across the 5 types, you'll see there are different synergy potentials depending on which type you choose, but also by the time you get to the conglomerate category at the end of the chart, you'll see really you're just diversifying risk, and maybe you can reduce the cost of capital in some way. So in other words, the synergy potential for conglomerates is the lowest on this chart, and the synergy potential for horizontal is the highest. And this is driving the idea that horizontal M&A or related M&A should actually be more successful than unrelated M&A. So to address that specific question, which is best, unrelated or related, essentially people are looking at the potentials rather than the outcomes. So potentials drive results, i.e. more areas for synergy gain, but they tend to not look at different levels of integration risk and complexity of integration, and also the timescales that are necessary for benefits to emerge. So whilst related might have a lot of potential for integration gains, there may be a lot of complexity in the integration which gets in the way of realizing those benefits. Conversely, with unrelated deals, you may not have so much potential, but then you may have low integration risks and benefits can emerge more quickly. Now, traditionally, we've tended to think about deals in terms of product market similarities, again, using the ANSOF framework. This tends to underplay the value of complementary synergies such as cross-selling, market access, knowledge transfer. So it's not just about sameness, but also some degree of fitness. And also, I think there's another issue here around unintended benefits and difficulties that might come about from integration. So in order to look at diversification performance in terms of relatedness and unrelatedness, a very famous article in the Strategic Management Journal by Parish, Cardinal and Miller in 2000 did a meta-analysis of 55 performance studies in order to try and work out where is higher performance and where is lower performance in terms of diversification. So performance is on the vertical axis, of course, and in terms of diversification, they use a Luffman Miller type typology at the bottom, talking about single companies versus related versus unrelated. And essentially the curve suggests that if you just stay as a single company, you have limited economies of scope available because of course you're in one area. If you go towards related businesses, then you can actually use some economies of scope by sharing resources and combining along the value chain. But if you become very unrelated, then actually there are lots of costs that might get in the way, particularly in terms of trying to coordinate and control across a diverse set of businesses. So this would tend to argue that M&A in related areas is generally a good thing, but perhaps you start getting diseconomies if you're unrelated. So with around 50% of deals failing and a large amount of resources consumed in the process, it's worth asking, why do so many M&A underperform? And here, just looking at pre-deal causes, there are a number we can identify. We can look at human frailty, by which I mean managerial hubris, which is defined as massive self-confidence and arrogance, often in the CEO, which means that they tend to take greater risks than perhaps they should, or they're doing things for their own particular aggrandizement and improvement rather than thinking about shareholders and the company. And they also might be part of the bandwagon effect that other competitors are acquiring, so they somehow feel they should as well. There's also, again, a human frailty aspect, which is around the Icarus paradox, that once they become successful, they feel they can do anything, and because they can now afford to purchase, because they have the status and the reputation, they just go ahead, even though those deals may not be quite so wise. Another aspect of this is overpayment, again a psychological issue, which Warren Buffett, the famous entrepreneur, made the following statement: "The market, like the Lord, helps those who help themselves, but, unlike the Lord, the market does not forgive those who know not what they do. A too high purchase price for the stock of an excellent company can undo the effects of a subsequent decade of favourable business developments. In other words, you might be able to get away perhaps with buying a company by paying too high a price, but the market is completely unforgiving, and so all you're essentially doing is undoing your ability to create value later on. Also linked to overpayment is the winner's curse, that you might actually be buying a company outbidding others, and therefore turning what might have been a good deal into something that is actually unattractive or possibly very unattractive. Another pre-deal reason is that inadequate due diligence, not giving enough time for investigation, or not having a wide enough scope, may make you vulnerable to serious problems in a target business that you've not discovered. We mentioned before also the problems of poor strategic fit. You may be buying a company that might look on the surface as attractive, but it may not fit terribly well with your strategy. And of course, timing is always an issue. Let's try to make sure that we don't buy things at the top of a boom, for instance, when the only direction of travel might be down. A useful survey by McKinsey in 2002 tried to take a more critical look at synergies and divide them into two types: revenue synergies or top-line synergies and cost synergies, getting your costs down. And what they found was interesting, that 70% of mergers, here they're really talking about acquisitions, failed to achieve anticipated revenue synergies. So they're saying that those companies trying to achieve revenue synergies often fell far short of the mark. And this may be because they ignored the dis-synergies that might come from revenue synergies. 1/4 of companies overestimated cost synergies by at least 25%, often underestimating one-time costs. But if you look at the charts at the bottom, if you look at the profile of the synergy gains, the right-hand side shows you, if you look at the extreme right-hand side, a very high proportion of companies achieving their cost synergies that they anticipated. Whereas if you look at the left-hand revenue synergies chart, again at the right-hand side, you see far fewer companies are actually achieving the anticipated revenue synergies. So I think the takeaway from this is that cost synergies, we can be relatively good at estimating them and achieving them because they're largely within our control as an acquirer. Revenue synergies, on the other hand, are not so much in our control and therefore are much harder to recognise. Therefore, when you're thinking about synergy gain, be very careful with your revenue synergy estimates. So pulling some of this together to answer the question, why do M&A underperform? I think one of the biggest problems with M&A research is there's tended to be this simple relationship that strategy should lead to performance. And that's very deeply rooted in the strategy literature, although now it's becoming more sophisticated. So linking motives to performance is difficult for a variety of reasons, and some of my early research was designed to expose this problem. Why would it be? Well, first of all, not all motives are profit maximizing, for instance. So you might have exploratory deals and survival deals where you're trying to find out new things or do things to survive that may be less about profit maximization and more about learning, for instance. So perhaps going into new deregulated territories might be an example. Something I'll talk more about in the next lecture is the problems of process. M&A is not cross-sectional. It's not a simple transaction, but it's a process that evolves over time, and the process itself can cause significant difficulties with realizing outcomes. Post-acquisition integration is something also that moderates the relationship between the strategy and the ultimate performance. And there's a lot of research going on at the moment attempting to try and understand the effect of post-acquisition integration. The sorts of things that might cause problems or organizational obstacles, for instance, where you can't put pieces of the organization together in the way that you thought was logical and sensible. There could be cultural clash where people have very, very strong views that differ from each other. So, as has been said very often, the post-merger integration phase or post-acquisition integration period is where value is either created or destroyed. And then finally, let's not forget the context the context will not stand still waiting for you to do your deal and realize value. The world doesn't stand still. And if you think about the supermarket activity after the Safeways deal, you'll recognize the competitors tried to exploit the situation, even though they couldn't actually acquire Safeways. And that actually destroyed value directly for Morrisons, who were the ultimate victors. So in conclusion, about 50% of M&A fail from a variety of perspectives. I've literally just carried out a research study for the Institute of Chartered Accountants of England and Wales. Hopefully that will be published in the next few months. And that shows that the failure rates are between 42 and 63%, with an average of around about 49%. So we are still at around 49-50% as a failure rate for M&A, even though decades of time has passed. However, interestingly enough, my work with the ICAEW also shows that managers believe 72% are successful. So clearly there's a paradox here between what the abstract market data tells us, the share price movements, and what managers believe. And that's the sort of thing we might try to explore in the subsequent lectures. Now, the performance debate is not going away. The reason is that there are many measures and assumptions, but perhaps they're rather too crude, and perhaps we're focusing on not quite the right things. There's a lot of focus now on what we might call meta-performance, which is saying rather than looking at strategy and ultimate performance over, say, 5 years, we should be looking at some of the stepping stones between the deal being announced and arriving at that ultimate performance. So, for instance, we should look at individual aspects of performance, such as factory integration, cultural alignment, IT integration, as performance outcomes in their own right, as part of a journey to arriving at the final overall outcome measure. But, as you're probably guessing already, this still doesn't really answer the paradox of why so many deals continue to happen if they're all so bad.